At exactly 8:42 p.m., in a private dining room 40 floors above downtown Chicago, a millionaire made a mistake that would cost him everything. Not in months, not in weeks, but in less than 10 minutes. Because the woman he chose to humiliate that night was never just a waitress. She stood there in silence, holding a tray steady in her hands, absorbing every word he said, every careless insult he threw into a room filled with people who suddenly didn't know where to look. And in that moment, something shifted. You could feel it without anyone saying a word. The kind of silence that doesn't come from comfort, but from realization. The realization that a line had just been crossed, and there was no going back. Because what he didn't know, what no one at that table realized, was that she understood everything. Every conversation, every quiet remark spoken in confidence, every assumption made about her standing just a few feet away. She wasn't reacting. She wasn't defending herself. She wasn't doing anything at all. And somehow, that made it worse. Because while he believed he was in control of the room, she was already in control of something much bigger. Something that extended far beyond that table, beyond that building, beyond that single night. She was fluent in 5 languages. Not just enough to get by, not just conversational. Fluent in the way that meant she didn't translate in her head. She understood tone, intention, hesitation. She heard what people meant, not just what they said. And every one of those languages, spoken casually around that table by investors who believed they were speaking freely, carried information. Information that would unravel deals, expose contradictions, and turn confidence into doubt faster than anyone thought possible. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The man at the center of it all was Daniel Mercer, a self-made millionaire who had built his reputation on control. Control over negotiations, over people, over outcomes. He was known for closing deals others couldn't, for pushing boundaries others avoided, and for saying things out loud that most people kept to themselves. In his world, respect wasn't given, it was taken. And on that night, surrounded by international investors who were deciding the future of his company, he believed he was doing exactly that. Establishing dominance. Reminding everyone in the room who was in charge. But control has a weakness. It relies on information. And the moment information starts slipping through unnoticed, control begins to break. That night, Mercer thought he was the most informed person at the table. He believed he understood every angle of the deal, every expectation, every concern. What he didn't realize was that the one person he dismissed the fastest was the only one who could see the full picture. Her name was Claire Bennett. To everyone in that room, she was just another staff member working a late shift, moving quietly between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates. But Claire hadn't always lived that life. Years earlier, she had graduated at the top of her class from a respected university, specializing in international business and corporate compliance. She had worked in rooms just like this one, sitting across from executives like Mercer, analyzing contracts, catching inconsistencies, preventing deals from collapsing under hidden risks. Then life shifted. A series of events that no one in that dining room knew about forced her out of that world and into another. One that required long hours, quiet resilience, and the ability to observe without being seen. But what never left her was her training, her attention to detail, her ability to listen beyond the surface. So when Mercer spoke that night, when he dismissed her with a comment meant to reduce her to nothing more than background noise, he made a calculation. A simple one. That she didn't matter. That she didn't understand. That she had no influence on what was about to happen. And for the first few minutes, it seemed like he was right. Conversations continued. Glasses were raised. Deals were discussed in English, then shifted into German between 2 investors seated near the window. A concern was raised about contract timelines. Mercer responded confidently, assuring them that everything had been accounted for. A few seats down, another pair switched into French, quietly questioning whether the terms they had received matched what had been promised earlier in the week. Claire heard all of it. She moved from one side of the room to the other, steady, composed, invisible in the way service staff are expected to be. But inside, she was connecting pieces. Not reacting emotionally, not rushing to act, just listening. Because the more she heard, the clearer it became that something wasn't right. Details didn't align. Statements contradicted each other. and the man leading the conversation either didn't notice or believed no one else would. By the time she reached the end of the table again, the room had changed. Subtle at first, a hesitation in someone's voice, a pause before a response, the kind of shift that only happens when confidence begins to crack. And it was in that moment, standing just within earshot, that Claire made a decision. She could have stayed silent, finished her shift, walked away like nothing had happened. But something about the way Mercer had spoken, the certainty in his voice, the assumption that no one around him could challenge him, made that impossible. So when he spoke again, dismissing a concern raised in German with a wave of his hand, Claire did something no one expected. She answered, fluently, clearly, without hesitation. And in that instant, every conversation in the room stopped. Who was she really? The woman standing quietly at the edge of a table filled with men who controlled millions of dollars and believed they understood everything happening around them. Why was Claire Bennett, someone who could step into a high-level negotiation without missing a single detail, carrying plates instead of leading conversations? And more importantly, how did a single moment, one careless decision made in less than 10 seconds, begin a chain reaction that would unravel a $120 million company before dessert was even served? Because what happened next was not loud, it wasn't chaotic, and it didn't unfold the way anyone in that room expected. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation that made it obvious something had gone wrong. Instead, it began with something much quieter, something far more dangerous in a room where trust and perception meant everything. It began with doubt. The kind of doubt that spreads slowly, moving from one person to another, changing the way they hear, the way they interpret, the way they question what they had already agreed to just moments before. Daniel Mercer felt it before he fully understood it. That subtle shift in the room, the way attention moved away from him and toward her, the way the investors who had been nodding along with his every word suddenly became still, focused, listening more carefully than they had all evening. For a man who had built his entire career on reading rooms, controlling conversations, and staying 3 steps ahead of everyone else, this was unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory is where mistakes multiply. Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to dominate the conversation. She simply clarified what had just been said in German, repeating it in precise, fluent English, but with one key difference. She didn't soften the meaning. She didn't adjust the tone to make it easier to accept. She translated it exactly as it was intended. A concern about timeline discrepancies. A quiet suspicion that the numbers being presented didn't align with earlier documents. Something Mercer had brushed aside with confidence just seconds earlier. Now it was out in the open. And once something like that is said clearly, directly, in a room full of people who have money on the line, it can't be unheard. It forces a decision. Ignore it and risk being wrong, or investigate it and risk discovering something far worse. The investors exchanged looks, subtle but unmistakable. A shift in posture, a change in expression, the beginning of questions forming in their minds that hadn't been there before. Mercer responded quickly, as he always did, stepping in to regain control. He smiled, corrected her, or at least attempted to, dismissing her words as a misunderstanding. But in doing so, he made his second mistake. Because now the room wasn't just listening to him. They were comparing, measuring his response against what they had just heard, against what they remembered, against what they were starting to piece together on their own. And Claire knew it. She didn't interrupt again immediately. She let the moment breathe, let the silence stretch just enough to make people uncomfortable. Because discomfort creates focus, and focus reveals truth. When another investor spoke, this time in French, raising a slightly different concern about contractual obligations, Claire remained still for a moment longer, giving Mercer the chance to respond first. He did, confidently, repeating the same pattern. Assurance, deflection, control. Then she spoke again. Fluent, precise, unmistakable. And just like that, the second layer of doubt settled over the room. This wasn't coincidence anymore. It wasn't a one-off misunderstanding that could be brushed aside. It was a pattern. And patterns, especially in high-stakes negotiations, are what people pay attention to. Because patterns suggest intent. And intent changes everything. At that point, the dinner was no longer about closing a deal. It had become something else entirely. An evaluation. Not of the company's potential, but of the man leading it. The investors were no longer asking whether the opportunity was profitable. They were asking whether it was trustworthy. And Daniel Mercer, for the first time that night, was no longer the one asking the questions. Daniel Mercer didn't start at the top. His story was the kind people liked to repeat, the self-made narrative that turned risk into reputation and confidence into authority. He built his company from a small logistics operation into a global supply chain network that moved pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, and high-value technology across continents. On paper, it was impressive. Rapid growth, aggressive expansion, and deals that seemed to appear out of nowhere. But behind that success was a pattern that people close to him understood well. Mercer didn't negotiate, he pressured. He didn't collaborate, he controlled. And control, to him, meant pushing people until they either delivered or disappeared. Over time, that approach became his identity. He was known for walking into rooms and taking over conversations within minutes, for interrupting people mid-sentence, for turning small mistakes into public lessons. Employees didn't challenge him, not because they agreed with him, but because they understood the cost of doing so. Investors respected him, but it was a cautious respect, built as much on results as it was on the understanding that Mercer operated in a way that left very little room for error. He demanded precision, but rarely offered patience. And in his world, respect was something you earned by proving you could keep up, not something you were given by default. That night in Chicago was supposed to reinforce everything he had built. A private dinner with international investors, the final stage before securing a deal that would push his company into a new level of global influence. The kind of deal that would validate his methods, justify his reputation, and silence any lingering doubts about how he operated. He walked into that room expecting alignment, expecting agreement, expecting the same outcome he had engineered dozens of times before. What he didn't expect was resistance, especially not from someone he had already decided didn't matter. Claire Bennett was easy to overlook at first. She moved quietly, spoke only when necessary, and carried herself with the kind of efficiency that made her blend into the background. 38 years old, working double shifts, taking on extra hours whenever they were available. To most people in that room, she was exactly what she appeared to be. Someone doing a job, someone passing through their evening without leaving any impression behind. But the details didn't quite align if you looked closely enough. There was a precision in the way she moved, a level of awareness that went beyond routine service. She anticipated requests before they were spoken, adjusted her timing based on the flow of conversation, positioned herself in a way that allowed her to hear without appearing to listen. And when she did speak, even if it was just a simple response, there was clarity in her voice, a kind of control that didn't match the role she was playing. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once noticed, it was difficult to ignore. Outside that room, her life followed a very different rhythm. Long hours, early mornings, responsibilities that didn't pause when her shift ended. She was supporting her daughter, managing expenses that left little room for error, making decisions every day that balanced necessity with survival. It was the kind of life that required discipline, patience, and the ability to keep moving forward without drawing attention to the weight being carried. And yet, even within that routine, there were signs that her story didn't begin there. She didn't belong there. And deep down, everyone in that room could feel it, even if they couldn't explain why. It showed in small moments. A brief correction of a mispronounced word in Spanish, offered quietly, almost instinctively, before she caught herself and stepped back. A glance toward a conversation happening in French, not with confusion, but with recognition. The way she paused, just slightly, when someone switched into German, as if adjusting not to the language, but to the meaning behind it. These were not the reactions of someone hearing unfamiliar sounds. These were the reactions of someone processing information in real time. What no one realized, what Mercer didn't even consider, was that Claire wasn't just hearing fragments. She was understanding everything. Every concern, every hesitation, every detail that was being shared under the assumption that it remained within a closed circle. And in a room where millions of dollars depended on clarity, on alignment, on trust, that kind of awareness carried a weight no one had accounted for. Because information, when it's complete, changes the balance of power. And that night, without announcing it, without drawing attention to it, Claire Bennett held more of it than anyone else in the room. By the time the main course was served, The tone of the evening had settled into something that looked, on the surface, like progress. The private dining room overlooked the city, glass walls reflecting soft light across a long table where conversations moved between English, German, French, Spanish, and Japanese without hesitation. These were not casual discussions. Every word carried weight. Every pause suggested evaluation. Every agreement hinted at millions of dollars preparing to move. Daniel Mercer sat at the center of it all, guiding the rhythm, directing attention, shaping the narrative the way he always had. Claire Bennett moved through the room with quiet precision, placing dishes, refilling glasses, stepping in and out of conversations without leaving a trace. To most of the people seated there, she was invisible in the way service staff are expected to be. Present, but not part of the equation. And for a while, that assumption held. Conversations continued freely, shifting between languages when needed, allowing investors to express concerns or observations they preferred to keep within smaller circles at the table. It was during one of those moments, when the discussion briefly slowed and attention scattered, that Mercer made his move. He leaned back slightly, glanced in Claire's direction, and with a tone that carried just enough volume to reach everyone without sounding forced, he said, "I don't get served by nobodies." The reaction was immediate, but restrained. A few short laughs, uncertain and uneven. Some eyes dropped to the table. Others shifted toward Claire, then quickly away again, as if acknowledging what had been said without wanting to engage with it. Discomfort settled in, quiet but unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of moment that stopped a meeting, but it was the kind that changed its atmosphere. Claire didn't respond. She didn't pause or react in any visible way. She continued with her task, placing a glass carefully in front of one of the investors, her expression unchanged, her movement steady. And for Mercer, that was confirmation. Confirmation that his assumption had been correct, that she didn't understand, that she couldn't respond, that the comment would pass without consequence. But he didn't stop there. A few minutes later, as the conversation shifted into German between two investors discussing delivery timelines, Mercer leaned forward again, this time speaking more quietly, but still loud enough for those nearby to hear. He made another remark, sharper, more dismissive, referencing Claire in a way that suggested she was nothing more than background noise, someone who existed only to serve and disappear. The investors continued speaking, their conversation uninterrupted, but now there was a subtle change. A hesitation, a slight awareness that something had been said that didn't sit quite right. Claire, standing just within range, remained still for a brief moment, her attention fixed not on Mercer, but on the conversation unfolding in German. She heard everything. She heard the concern about discrepancies in reported timelines. She heard the uncertainty about whether previous assurances matched current projections. She heard the tone behind the words. The hesitation that suggested doubt had already begun to form. And as the conversation shifted again, this time into French, raising a different concern about contractual clarity, she absorbed that as well, connecting details, aligning information, building a complete picture that no one else in the room fully possessed. She understood all of it. Not fragments, not isolated comments, but the entire structure of what was being said and what it meant. And in a setting like that, where information is often divided by language, by assumption, by selective disclosure, that level of understanding changes everything. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Conversations continued. Mercer responded where needed, maintaining his usual confidence, unaware that the foundation beneath him was beginning to shift. Claire took a step back, allowing the moment to settle, allowing the information she had gathered to reach its full weight. Then she spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough that the words carried across the table. In German, her pronunciation was precise, her tone controlled, her delivery calm. She repeated the concern that had just been raised, translating it into direct, unfiltered English, removing any ambiguity, any softening that might have been present in the original exchange. And just like that, the room froze. Every conversation stopped. The investors who had been speaking looked up immediately, their expressions shifting from casual focus to sharp attention. Mercer turned toward her, his expression tightening, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how someone he had dismissed moments earlier had just inserted herself into a conversation he believed she couldn't follow. Claire didn't wait. She continued. French, then Spanish, then Japanese. Each language delivered with the same level of clarity, the same precision, the same controlled tone that left no room for doubt. She translated concerns, highlighted inconsistencies, connected points that had been scattered across separate conversations, bringing them together into a single, undeniable narrative. And with each word, the balance in the room shifted further. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't someone speaking out of place. This was deliberate. And that's when the room realized something that Daniel Mercer had not yet fully grasped. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. The energy in the room didn't collapse all at once. It shifted, carefully, almost methodically, as if each person present needed a moment to reassess what they had just witnessed before deciding how to respond. The conversation didn't resume in the way Mercer expected. Instead of returning to him, control of the room began to fragment, moving from one investor to another as questions replaced assumptions and certainty gave way to analysis. This was no longer a negotiation moving toward agreement. It had become an examination. One of the German investors leaned forward first, his tone measured but direct, asking Mercer to clarify the timeline Claire had just translated. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with the kind of precision that signals concern. Mercer responded quickly, offering the same explanation he had given earlier, but now it sounded different. Not because the words had changed, but because the context had. The room was no longer hearing him in isolation. They were comparing his response against what Claire had just revealed. Another voice entered, this time from the French side of the table, questioning the contractual obligations tied to that same timeline. The wording was careful, but the implication was clear. There were inconsistencies, and they needed to be addressed. Mercer adjusted again, attempting to bridge the gap, to reframe the concern as a misunderstanding, something minor that could be resolved without altering the overall structure of the deal. But Claire had already shifted the foundation. She didn't interrupt immediately. She allowed the questions to build, allowed Mercer to respond, allowed the room to process the differences between what was being asked and what was being answered. Then, when the moment was right, she clarified again. Not emotionally, not forcefully, but with the same calm precision that had stopped the room before. She pointed out a detail in the contract language, a phrasing that, when translated directly, carried a different obligation than the one Mercer had been presenting. It was subtle, but critical, and once it was spoken out loud, it couldn't be dismissed. The structure of the conversation began to resemble something else entirely. Not a business dinner, but an investigation. Each statement Mercer made was examined, each reassurance tested against what had already been said. Investors began referencing earlier parts of the conversation, asking for confirmation, for consistency, for clarity. And with each exchange, Claire's earlier translations became points of reference, anchoring the discussion in a version of the truth that Mercer could no longer fully control. For months, he had been saying one thing and signing another. That realization didn't arrive as a single moment of shock. It unfolded gradually, as pieces aligned and patterns emerged. The discrepancies weren't isolated. They connected across timelines, across documents, across conversations that had taken place long before that dinner. What had once been seen as confidence now began to look like deflection. What had been interpreted as leadership started to resemble something else entirely. The questions grew sharper. Not louder, not aggressive, but more precise. Investors began asking about specific clauses, about wording that had seemed routine at the time, but now carried different implications. Claire, standing just outside the center of the table, continued to clarify when necessary, never overstepping, never dominating, but always adding just enough information to keep the process moving forward. And with every clarification, the room moved further away from Mercer's control. At the same time, a different line of thought began to form. Quietly, almost instinctively, people started asking themselves a different question, one that had nothing to do with the contract itself. Who was she? Because this didn't feel accidental. The timing, the precision, the way she introduced information only when it mattered most. It raised possibilities that hadn't been considered before. Was she placed there intentionally? Was this part of a larger strategy? Corporate sabotage wasn't uncommon at this level, and the idea that someone might use access, language, and proximity to influence a deal wasn't impossible. I shifted toward Claire more frequently now, not dismissively, not casually, but with focus, trying to place her, to understand her role, to determine whether she was acting independently or as part of something larger. Mercer noticed it too, and for the first time that night, his attention wasn't on the deal. It was on her. He watched her movements, her timing, the way she chose when to speak and when to remain silent. And in that observation, a new kind of uncertainty began to take hold. Because if this was intentional, if she had positioned herself in that room for a reason, then the situation was far more serious than a few inconsistencies in a contract. The room continued to dissect the details, moving back through earlier conversations, replaying moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried weight. A comment made in German about delivery schedules. A question raised in Spanish about pricing structures. A brief exchange in Japanese about regulatory compliance. Each one, when revisited, revealed a layer that hadn't been fully understood before. Claire had heard all of it, and she had connected it in a way no one else had. The atmosphere tightened, not with panic, but with focus. The kind of focus that comes when people realize they may have missed something important. And in that focus, in that collective shift toward analysis, the balance of power continued to move, quietly but decisively, away from Daniel Mercer. Then, in the middle of that silence, as one of the investors studied her more closely, something changed. Recognition. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Then someone in the room recognized her name. The recognition didn't come with an outburst. It came quietly, from across the table, from one of the senior investors who had been listening more than speaking throughout the evening. He leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on Claire Bennett, studying her with a level of attention that suggested memory rather than curiosity. When he finally spoke, his tone wasn't questioning. It was certain. He said her name again, slower this time, as if confirming it for himself, and then he added something that shifted the entire room in an instant. He referenced a compliance review from years earlier, an international case that had exposed inconsistencies in cross-border contracts, a case that had forced multiple firms to restructure their agreements under scrutiny. Claire didn't respond immediately. She didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, didn't step forward to explain. But her silence said enough. Because the moment her name was placed in that context, the room understood who she was. Not a server working a late shift by chance, but a former international compliance analyst who had spent years identifying exactly the kind of inconsistencies now being discussed at that table. Someone trained to detect misalignment between what was promised and what was written, between what was presented and what was binding. The questions changed instantly. They were no longer directed at her. They were directed at Mercer. More direct now, more specific, grounded in the understanding that the situation had moved beyond uncertainty. Investors began referencing prior documents, asking for clarification on clauses that had previously seemed routine. They weren't asking if there was a problem anymore. They were asking how deep it went. And Mercer, for the first time that night, didn't have immediate answers that satisfied the room. Why she was there became clearer in fragments, not through a single explanation, but through what others began to recall. A career that had ended abruptly after a series of internal disagreements. A reputation for refusing to overlook details that others preferred to ignore. A professional path that had placed her in direct opposition to companies operating in ways similar to Mercer's. Whether she had been watching him specifically, or whether this moment had formed through circumstance, didn't fully matter anymore. What mattered was that she understood exactly what she was looking at, and she had chosen to act on it. The shift in power was no longer subtle. One of the investors closed his folder. Another leaned back, arms crossed, no longer engaged in negotiation, but in evaluation. A third asked a direct question about liability, about what would happen if the discrepancies Claire had pointed out extended beyond this deal. The tone was no longer collaborative. It was cautious, calculated, and increasingly distant. Mercer attempted to regain control. He adjusted his posture, leaned forward, reasserted his voice into the conversation with the same confidence that had carried him through countless negotiations before. He reframed the situation, called it a misunderstanding, suggested that minor translation differences had been exaggerated. He tried to redirect the focus back to the opportunity, to the scale of the deal, to the benefits that had brought everyone into that room in the first place. But the room didn't follow. Because once doubt reaches a certain point, it doesn't respond to reassurance. It responds to evidence. And every time Mercer spoke, the investors were no longer hearing just his words. They were weighing them against everything Claire had already clarified, against the patterns they were beginning to recognize, against the possibility that what they had been presented was not what they were being asked to agree to. The first decision came quietly. One of the investors stated that he would need to pause his involvement until further review. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't confrontational, but it carried weight. Because in a deal structured on collective confidence, one withdrawal creates space for others to follow. And they did, one after another, each response measured, each decision framed as caution rather than rejection, but all leading in the same direction. Distance. The deal didn't collapse with a single statement. It unraveled in real time, as commitment turned into hesitation, and hesitation turned into withdrawal. The structure Mercer had built began to lose its support, not because it was attacked directly, but because the people holding it up chose to step back. He didn't lose his company that night. He lost the people who made it possible. And without them, the outcome was already decided. Mercer tried once more to pull the conversation back, to isolate the issue, to contain it, but the momentum had shifted too far. The room was no longer his to control. It belonged to the questions he couldn't fully answer, to the details he couldn't easily dismiss, to the realization that the foundation of the deal had been compromised in a way that couldn't be ignored. Claire remained where she was, composed, steady, no longer speaking because she didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been placed into the room. The outcome was unfolding on its own. And Mercer, for the first time in a long time, was no longer leading the conversation. He was reacting to it. And failing. The room didn't end with an argument. It ended with distance. Chairs shifted back, folders closed. Conversations that had once been aligned now moved in separate directions. One by one, the investors stood, not in frustration, but in quiet decision. There was no need for dramatic exits or raised voices. The outcome had already been decided long before anyone reached the door. Daniel Mercer remained seated for a moment longer, watching the structure he had spent years building lose its support in a matter of minutes. Not through force, but through clarity. Claire Bennett didn't stay to watch what followed. She didn't wait for acknowledgement, didn't look for validation, didn't offer any final words to explain what had just happened. She simply stepped back, placed the last glass on the table with the same steady precision she had shown all evening, and walked away. No hesitation, no pause, no expression that suggested victory or regret. Just silence. The kind of silence that carries more weight than any explanation ever could. Because the truth was, she was never there for revenge. She hadn't entered that room with a plan to expose Daniel Mercer, hadn't positioned herself to dismantle a deal or shift the balance of power in a single evening. She was there because she needed the job, because life had moved her into a position where survival came before recognition, where responsibility came before reputation. Everything that happened after that first moment wasn't strategy. It was response. A response to what she heard, to what she understood, to what she couldn't ignore once it was placed in front of her. And Mercer, without realizing it, had created his own downfall. Not through one decision, but through a pattern. Through the way he spoke, the way he dismissed, the way he assumed that control meant being the only one who understood the room. He didn't lose because someone set out to take something from him. He lost because the truth reached the wrong person at the wrong time, and that person had the ability to see it clearly. By the time the elevators closed and the floor returned to its usual quiet, the deal was gone. The confidence that had supported it was gone, and the version of control Mercer believed he had maintained was gone with it. What remained wasn't chaos. It was consequence. Quiet, immediate, and irreversible. Power doesn't collapse because of enemies. It collapses when the wrong person sees the truth. And the only question that remains is this. If you were in that room, watching it all unfold in real time, would you have noticed what he missed? What do you think? Was this revenge or was it justice? Take a moment and really think about it, because the answer isn't as simple as it seems. Let me know in the comments. I read them all, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on what really happened in that room. And if you think this story was intense, Wait until you hear what happened when a CEO fired the wrong employee on live television. Subscribe if you want more stories where power meets consequences.